Africa Prime, brought to you by Jameson's Select Reserve.
Africa has produced a plethora of talent, from the likes of Nelson Mandela to Kwame Nkrumah through the years, though the follow-through on some of the great ideas that have come through remains low, because political capital is weak and society too scared to try a different way of doing things. This is the show that attempts to break through these barriers, to unravel the talent and identify the next generation of leaders that truly can move Africa forward. Hello and welcome to this, the very first edition of Africa Prime. I'm Godfrey Mutizwa. This week, we set the scene with the gathering of minds to give us the views on leadership in Africa. With me in the studio is Professor Gilbert Khadiagala. He is Head of Department, International Relations at Wits University, as well as Moeletsi Mbeki. He is Deputy Chairman of the South African Institute of International Affairs. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor, let me begin with you. Like the child of history that you are. Africa, the first African nation to be independent was Ghana, 1957. 1957, 55, thereabouts. Since that time, when you look back, would you say Africa, through its crop of leadership that has come through, has been able to move forward?
Accurately, the first African country to get independence was Sudan, actually in '56, followed by...
that little historical fact is somehow lost because we focus on Kwame Nkrumah.
No, that's true. We focus pretty much on Kwame Nkrumah because he was one of the founding fathers of African liberation. So Ghana got its independence in '57. To come back to your question, I think Africa has done fairly well in getting itself together in the 54 or so years that most African countries have been independent. 50 years is not a very long time in the bigger scale of political development. So I think we should be celebrating that Africa has survived. The leaders that took power in the 60s and from Nkrumah into the 60s were called the founding fathers, and they are no longer, most of them are no longer with us, but they laid the foundation for the current debates about where Africa should be going.
I want to put you on the spot. Define fairly well for me.
Fairly well is defined in terms of, after colonialism, African countries had very fragile nation states. They were not even sure about whether they would survive as states. And for the most part, the states in Africa have remained very much the way the colonialists left them. So I think that's a big element of success. And once you have fairly functional states, that gives you the opportunity to begin to talk about other things, about leadership, about economic development. So I think Africa should congratulate itself for having survived, but that's not enough. The other point to argue is what has been done beyond just simply consolidating the nation state, which was really the big agenda in the 60s and the 70s. And I think that goal has been achieved. And so now we have to move forward.
But maybe before we go and examine that goal, let me bring in Mr. Mbeki here. Let's begin first of all by getting your view on whether Africa has moved forward. He marks the leadership that has emerged out of the continent as having done fairly well. You are a student of history as well yourself. You look at international affairs as the deputy chairman of SIA. Do you agree? Have we done fairly well?
I would use I would give a far less mark than fairly well. First, we shouldn't forget the civil wars that have happened in Africa. The Nigerian Civil War, where 1 million people have been killed. We shouldn't forget the genocide in Rwanda, where again nearly 1 million people were killed. So yes, I would say taking the continent as a whole, we've done fairly well, but we have also done extremely badly in some instances. The largest country in Africa is going to break up on Saturday, Sudan. Why? Because of the attacks and the persecution of the people of southern Sudan by the northern Sudanese, to such an extent that a country that should be the flagship of Africa is now breaking apart. So yes, we've done fairly well. But we have to learn from the lessons, and this to me is the critical factor. We have to learn from the lessons of the past 55 years so that we don't repeat them going forward.
I dare say we will be able to learn when we know why what has happened has happened. So let's play the blame game. Who is to blame?
Well, for me, there were many culprits. The Americans were one of the culprits. They killed Patrice Lumumba.
Agreed.
One of the great heroes of Africa. The Americans removed Nkrumah. The archive material coming out, being produced by the Americans themselves, show that they were participants in the removal of Nkrumah from power. The Soviet Union was another culprit which played a very important role. One day they supported Somalia and egged it on to fight against Ethiopia. The next day they supported the Ethiopian military and encouraged it to kill lots and lots of young people in Ethiopia. So the Soviet Union was another culprit. However, one cannot say it was just the foreigners. We have our guilty people, Mobutu, the Mobutus of the world, the apartheid regime in South Africa, the National Party in South Africa was one of the major culprits in the destabilizing Southern Africa. And there are many others who one can point a finger to.
Let's get the professor to give us his view.
I think the culprits, as Moeletsi mentions, are
You agree with some of the ones that he
I
has
agree
mentioned.
with him in terms
What
of...
would you add to the list?
What I would add to the list is, I mean, leadership in Africa has always been wanting. In fact, from the days of the founding fathers.
Yeah, you get the leadership you deserve.
You get the leadership you deserve because at some point, I think in the 40 years, we were all mesmerized by the messianism of our leaders. I mean, we always liked big men and big women to govern us. We were never really interested in leaders whose hands were tied by institutions. We never invested in institutions. We've always celebrated our leaders to the detriment, really, of our own self. And so this is, I think, the learning, the lessons that has been learned over the last few years is to what extent do you find leadership that is actually anchored within institutional frameworks? And this is the democracy debate that has been in Africa since the 1990s, or even since the early 60s. To what extent do you have leaders that respect the voices of the larger majority? And I think that's a bigger element in the problems that we've had over the years.
Yeah.
And so the external component is as equally important as the internal one, where we have to begin to move to rethink the kind of leaders who are actually leading us.
Yeah. Now, Moeletsi raised an important point. He said the key is that what have we learned from the mistakes and from the lessons that we've seen in the past? In your opinion, have we learned from the mistakes of the past? And let's lace that with examples.
There is actually learning that has been going on, and it's very difficult to say there is a clear learning process. I think some countries are doing very well, especially countries that have gone through civil wars.
On balance?
On balance, you have countries like Liberia that have recovered fairly fast. You have countries like Sierra Leone that have also recovered from civil wars of the 90s.
The problem is, I'll just say they represent maybe 0.011% of Africa's population.
But we are looking at countries that were at war.
Okay.
The other component of it is that there were countries that were actually never at war, but they still face the same problems of big men and dictatorial leaderships and so on. They also face the problems of lack of institutions. But gradually, I think we're beginning to see countries, even countries such as Nigeria, we're beginning actually to gradually begin to hold, elections that are beginning to look like they are competitive elections. You are beginning to look at countries like Kenya, for instance, that have gone through a period of instability at some point, but are gradually and quickly recovering from these kinds of problems.
Moeletsi, are we beginning to see real examples of Africa having learned from its mistakes?
I think so. I think we are seeing the examples. We're also seeing examples of countries not learning from the mistake.
Yeah.
I can give you the example of our neighbor, which is Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, I was a student with Zimbabweans. I belonged to African students organizations when we were studying in Europe. We were together and we learned a lot from countries that were independent. But I'm shocked to realize that today, Zimbabwe is repeating the mistakes that were made, especially in the 60s and some in the 70s. So there are some who have learned. I can give the example of Zambia. Zambia has been very consistent that there should be no violent conflict within Zambia, because they were living in a region that had huge armed conflicts. So they learned that the best way is actually for the population to discuss and find solutions to their problems.
So are you more encouraged than you are discouraged by the current state of affairs in Africa's leadership?
I'm hugely encouraged, not by the African leadership.
Yeah.
I'm hugely encouraged by the African people. I think what we are seeing in North Africa is that the people have moved away from what Gilbert was called the big man or the big woman. The people are now saying, we will take our destiny into our own hands. We will run the country. We will design the democracy of our countries. We will not have it given to us by donors and prescribed to us by foreigners. We build our own democracy. I was very encouraged to read last week that the Egyptians, for example, are developing their own Bill of Rights, which is being developed to take into consideration the religious issues that they're different, more conservative Muslims, they are more moderate Muslims, they are Coptics. So they are writing their own Bill of Rights to suit their own people and their own cultures. So I am very, very encouraged by the people of Africa. The leaders of Africa, no. I am not encouraged by the so-called leaders of Africa. And I can give you many reasons why I'm not.